Well, hello, and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. Well, firstly, can I thank listeners for writing in with your many suggestions for topics for Series 3. And one of the most requested topics we had was a very difficult and sensitive one, and that was miscarriage. So today on this episode, we're going to hear from Karen Burgess, who is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Petals, the Baby Loss Counselling Charity. And she's also joined by Molly Hunter, who is a wife and mother to 3 children. And between the births of her first and second children, Molly sadly had 4 miscarriages. Well, can I thank you both so much for coming on today's episode? And we did an earlier episode in the year on baby loss, and we had a huge response from the public asking for advice. So I'm so pleased that you're both here today to share some really personal experiences, in your case, Molly, and you, Karen, to talk a bit about the work of your charity and hopefully to signpost affected families to ways to get help. So perhaps, Karen, if we could start there, for listeners who are kind of less familiar with the term miscarriage, could you just tell us what it is?
Yes, of course. And thank you, Theo. Thank you for inviting me onto this very important podcast. So, yes, miscarriage. Interesting word, isn't it? And I think before I kind of get into that, I just wanted to just first of all say a little bit about the language that we use around pregnancy and baby loss, how dismissive it can be sometimes. And miscarriage is one of those words. I feel that quite strongly, that the connotation of the word miscarriage is a failure, and that is so often what feeds the taboo and the stigma around baby loss, pregnancy loss. I think we all have to be really sensitive about the language we use around this subject area, and always be thinking about the parents who sit at the heart of that, who are going through those very difficult experiences. So a miscarriage is the loss of a pregnancy. It is the process, the actual word miscarriage is talking about the process that the woman goes through as the baby, the fetus, the tissue, whatever terms that we want to feel comfortable with using there, leaves her body. And I think the bit that's often very shocking for people is that we use this term miscarriage for any pregnancy loss right up to 23 weeks and 6 days of gestation of pregnancy. So, we will all be aware that by that point, at 23 weeks and 6 days, this is a really established pregnancy. This is a baby. This is a formed baby. And so the experience of loss of that is always painful, physically painful. It is psychologically really distressing, and often traumatic for many parents. This type of loss has a profound effect. It's something that stays with women particularly, but partners too, for the rest of their lives. So it's so important that we don't sort of diminish this experience, and that we open up and talk about it. One of the really shocking terms that is now used when we talk about miscarriage is that half of adults in the UK will say that they either know someone or have actually experienced themselves pregnancy or baby loss. Half of adults. That blows my mind, to be honest, and it leaves me thinking, why are we not talking more openly about this? Why are we not really thinking about this and helping parents to normalize this experience? Now, in terms of any real numbers, true data, again, shocking, we don't actually have any, because we don't actually count the number of miscarriages that women are experiencing. So the data is really sparse, and I think that's something that needs to change. The numbers that we have generally relate to miscarriages where there has been the need for a hospital visit for some sort of treatment. And so they vary. I was trying to sort of get some numbers in preparation for this, and 110,000 in the UK a year, 150,000 a year. It varies. It really varies where you look. But what I strongly believe that the numbers are much, much higher than that, because so many women don't talk about it, don't actually tell people they've had a miscarriage. So for most miscarriages will happen in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, and that's what we term an early miscarriage. And it will most of the time be difficult, painful, quite shocking, but something that most of the time is recovered from physically within days or weeks, but psychologically often stays with parents for longer.
Okay, we'll get on to talk about psychological symptoms a bit later in the show, but perhaps, Karen, I could bring in Molly there. And first, I think you're so right, Karen, to say that this is not a subject which is spoken about enough. And that's why I'm so pleased today that we are breaking the taboo by speaking about miscarriage. And Molly, Karen there just set out some of the pretty shocking statistics, but I know it's always really helpful for mums listening to the show to have more of a kind of personal story. So firstly, thank you so much for very bravely coming on today's episode. And would you mind sharing what happened to you?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Theo. I had a little boy in 2017 and got pregnant again in early 2019. And because my first pregnancy had been relatively straightforward, I mean, it was high risk because I have an underlying medical condition, but it was straightforward in many respects. Early 2019, I'd had an 8-week scan, all was looking fine. And a few weeks later, I'd had some spotting, which is a term used to describe very light bleeding. It's normally where you can see where you white rather than it filling up any sort of pad. And I went to the early pregnancy unit to check what this was, and they told me that they could no longer see a heartbeat. And at that point, they said because the baby was measuring a few weeks behind, that I'd had what was called a miscarriage. And they recommended that I had surgery to remove it. So I had what was called an ERPC, which is the evacuation of retained products of conception, which is a really rather horrible term. At the time, I was just in a state of shock. I think all women who become pregnant will know that each second turns into a day, and each day turns into a month, and you just have, from the moment you become pregnant, you have so much hope for your future unborn child. You used to start planning, your due date, all these little things. The recovery, I took a couple of weeks off work. That was mainly because of the general anaesthetic, made me feel absolutely exhausted. But then started looking up at the statistics of having a second miscarriage, and was reassured that it's more likely to have one miscarriage than to go on and have a second. So a few months later, I became pregnant again, and a similar thing happened. We'd had scans at 8 weeks, saw a strong fetal heartbeat, and then went on to miscarry again. My second miscarriage was particularly complicated because, again, it was a miscarriage and I had to have another ERPC. But what happened this time was that they didn't remove all the pregnancy tissue. And so it became infected, and so I needed to be admitted to hospital to have IV antibiotics. And at this point, it had been 3 or 4 weeks since the first ERPC. And I asked whether I was going to have another ERPC to remove the remaining tissue, and they said they prefer to treat it conservatively because I'd already had 2, which means they sent me home and told me to wait it out. Anyway, I spent really the next 6 weeks sitting on my sofa waiting to fully miscarry. Obviously, couldn't work at this point. I just wasn't in the right state of mind to be able to go to work, knowing that, what I felt that I still had my baby inside me. And eventually I was offered another ERPC, but this time it was with a camera, so they could look to make sure that all the tissue was removed. The second miscarriage hit both me and my husband really hard because we just didn't expect it to happen, but it was just so brutal because we just had to go through this very long and extended process of surgeries and waiting to effectively fully miscarry so my body could get back to normal. And anyway, we were given the all clear to try again and became pregnant in January of 2020. And the early pregnancy unit at my hospital were absolutely fantastic. So I had a bleed quite early on, but they got me in every week to have scans to check that everything was going as it should be. And it progressed. Again, we'd seen a strong fetal heartbeat at 8 weeks, and it was soon after that that the scan the following week, so at 9 weeks, there was no heartbeat any longer. And that was so difficult because they said it was another miscarriage, and so they wanted me to have surgery again, but this time they gave me the choice. Rather than having an ERPC where you have it under general anaesthetic, they asked whether I wanted to have a local anaesthetic, and they would be able to scan me afterwards to check that all the tissue had been removed to avoid what had happened after my second miscarriage. So I opted for that, which in hindsight was a mistake because they perform what's called an MVA, which is a manual vacuum aspiration, and essentially you're awake and listening to Hoover sucking out the pregnancy tissue, the baby. Even though I was given a local anaesthetic, it just I think still now, and that's 5 years later, I can still hear that noise, and it was just very, very dark time for us. But at that point, we'd reached the 3 miscarriage mark, which meant on the NHS you could then begin to start tests. Everything, all my energy went into looking forward in a way to having these tests to get some answers. And then, of course, lockdown happened and everything was stopped, everything was cancelled. And this was incredibly difficult because we didn't have any answers. And I think as well as mourning the losses of these babies, I was feeling incredibly guilty that it was my fault that I was causing these miscarriages. And it was a very difficult time. The country was all closed down. I actually needed further surgery to remove adhesions, and I couldn't have that for another 8 months. But at the time, I didn't know when that was going to happen. So there was all these question marks in relation to how we were going to move forwards from this, and just dealing with the overwhelming sense of guilt as well. Anyway, I then became pregnant in the summer of 2021, and by this point I'd found a recurrent miscarriage consultant who I really trusted. He was fantastic. But this pregnancy was a little different. It turned out I had what's called a cervical ectopic pregnancy. So that was a pregnancy growing on my cervix. And in terms of resolving that, it got to the point where I'd lost so much blood, but they'd been very busy overnight dealing with other more emergent cases, that by the time I was brought through to be looked at, I'd lost so much blood they weren't able to give me any painkillers before scraping it out. And I blacked out from the pain after, when they asked me to sign the consent forms, which was afterwards. I blacked out from the pain, but at the time I didn't tell the lovely consultant who I'd seen lots of times that I was going to, that I felt so unbelievably awful because I was embarrassed. I felt, this was only at the 6-week mark. It was so early. Why was I feeling like this? And it seems a bit ridiculous looking back on it now, but I just wasn't able really to communicate how I was feeling. I went through a lot of treatment, a lot of tests, and in early 2022, I became pregnant again. And this time they told me I was pregnant with twins. And again, the early pregnancy unit were fantastic. I was brought in every week to have scans. And we saw 2 strong fetal heartbeats at 6 weeks. And then the 8-week scan, one of the heartbeats was no longer beating. And that pregnancy then did progress, and I had my daughter in the the summer of 2022, our rainbow baby, which was a very difficult pregnancy, but she's still yes, is yes, I spend a lot of time looking after her. She's a whirlwind, absolute whirlwind of energy and everything. But the pregnancy was very difficult because I'd had this miscarriage early on, and they called it vanishing twin syndrome, and this is where the body absorbs the pregnancy. And we just were told that I was probably going to miscarry her. So I became obsessed with looking at what a miscarriage looked like at every day of the pregnancy. I would look and try and prepare myself for what it was going to be like when I eventually miscarried, which I didn't, but this is what I spent my pregnancy doing. I spent my pregnancy researching what it was going to be like to miscarry from the moment we found out we were pregnant, really all the way through. But I had help. I was very lucky. I had help from an amazing therapist through the Maternity Trauma and Loss Care Service, which was able to support me. And I have no idea how I would have navigated that pregnancy without her. And actually, I've had another little girl 9 months ago, and the Maternity Trauma and Loss Care Service also supported me through that pregnancy. But more significantly, I developed quite severe PTSD, and after the birth of my daughter in 2022, they were able to treat that PTSD successfully.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good moment, actually, if we could talk a bit about psychological symptoms. And Molly, firstly, thank you for being so brave talking about it, because I think there is a taboo about speaking about this, and you have been quite graphic, and I think that's really important for mums to hear, what could happen. But the point of today's episode is to talk about help and resources. So perhaps, Karen, if we could give Molly a moment, could you talk a bit about the psychological impact of pregnancy loss at any gestation? We've just heard from Molly how incredibly life-changing it was, but you obviously speak to so many mothers who've been through the same. So what's the types of things that they'll experience?
Absolutely. And I hear everything that you say and recognise everything you say, Molly. So, gosh, you've been through so much, and, very courageous to talk about it here in this way. So, just about everything that we hear from parents, I think, is probably encapsulated within your story there, Molly. We find parents coming to us at any gestation of pregnancy loss, coming to Petals desperate, literally desperate for support, because the psychological impact, whether this is an early loss, whether this is a late loss, a stillbirth, a neonatal loss, it's equally distressing, very often from a psychological perspective. And what we see is that this is all related to the actual experience that women are going through through the experience of loss. And as Molly rightly described there, it is something that actually, when you hear it, it's really hard to believe. It's really hard to believe that you're sort of having to endure some of these really, really awful things. And so, of course, psychologically, that is going to stay with you. That is going to be a traumatic experience, and that is going to, unless you have the support to process it, it is going to impact your life going forward, and certainly impact further pregnancies and your response to that. The evidence is there too. A research project, a fairly well-known one now, through Imperial Hospital in London, led by Jess Farron in 2016, I think it was, looked at the psychological impact of miscarriage, and found that 39% of participants at 3 months post an early pregnancy were showing moderate to severe signs of PTSD. We know this. We know that this is happening. We also know that there is very little support out there. I'm delighted to hear that you have been able to get support through that maternal mental health pathway. Unfortunately, it's not there for everybody. It really is a postcode lottery. And so what it means is that parents are desperately looking for some support. Petals, they're coming to us on a weekly basis and telling similar stories, because it's really hard to move on. when you are sitting with an experience like this, it literally changes your perspective on life, and it impacts on your ability to function. And so you become desperate to want to fix that, to want to change that, to be able to move on and get on with your life.
Well, thank you for that, Karen. That was really helpful. And Molly, you did mention there that you were referred to a specialist NHS service. Could you talk a bit about what help you did receive that was helpful? And perhaps we could signpost some mums to where they might find support who've had a similar situation too.
Well, I received help from two different places. One of them, I actually received help from Petals, and this was in 2020 when I was going through a particularly difficult time. And what Petals was able to do was to help with my feelings of guilt and anger specifically, because I was really in the middle of everything then, and finding it very difficult to have normal conversations with people. And that was a complete lifeline, because Petals gave me the tools to be able to go out and really speak normally to people again. So that was the first thing. And then the maternity trauma and loss care service was absolutely wonderful. I was referred very early on, shortly after we lost the twin, and I had this amazing therapist, and she was the one who really was able to stop me obsessing over each day of the pregnancy. But she also she gave me all these coping techniques, and she was also able to help me connect with my baby growing in my tummy, because I really didn't want to even touch my tummy, didn't want to get too close. Or, at one point she asked me whether I'd spoken to the baby, and I just, the idea horrified me, because I didn't want to form any bonds, which would be harder once I then miscarried. So she was amazing, helped me through the whole pregnancy, but more significantly afterwards, she helped me resolve my PTSD. I don't have PTSD anymore. So I felt very lucky to have that, but I'm painfully aware that a maternity trauma and loss care service, it's not available to all women throughout the country, and it absolutely should be. And obviously it's not available to women who've gone through multiple miscarriages, because, as the word says, it's maternity trauma. So you don't get referred until you're lucky enough in the first place to be pregnant, and to be pregnant for long enough to get that referral.
Yeah, that's so shocking. Well, Karen, perhaps that's a good moment for us to bring in Petals and the work of what your really helpful charity does for women. So could you say a bit about the services that you provide, and most importantly, how should mums listening to the show get in touch who are looking for help today?
Absolutely. Thank you. So our mission at Petals is that we provide and promote specialist counselling for any parent who experiences any type of baby loss. We've been around for about 14 years now. I founded the charity. And what is really important to us is that this is a free counselling service. Parents should not be expected to pay for this support. We aim to be the next step of care for parents as they leave the maternity setting. So our kind of psychological profile of a client really is somebody who has literally just been through the experience of loss. And then what we aim to do is to help them to kind of process their experience, process the trauma that is most likely there, and then help them to re-engage with their life. So with that sort of almost transitional service between hospital and then moving on with life. Our work is unique in the sense that we provide our counselling for mums and dads. Individuals can come on their own, or they can come as a couple, and our model is the same. We will work with a couple together, or we will work with them individually. Our work is all done online. It's all on Teams, a little bit on Zoom. And we have a model. We have a model that has been tried and tested and evidence that is a brief intervention. It is generally a triage assessment followed by 5 counselling sessions, which we aim to deliver across a 3-month period. So we're sort of spreading it out a little bit in order for parents to kind of get the benefit of the support over a longer period of time. And the aim of the work, as I say, is to help those parents to just adjust to this experience that they've been through. Because I think that is what I see is the most destructive part often of pregnancy loss, is the experience that parents actually have to endure. They're not expecting it. They're expecting something positive, joyful. The whole family's expecting that. And when that suddenly comes crashing down, many people are struggling. Many people are struggling to cope and to move forward.
Molly, just listening to your story and particularly how you went on to develop PTSD, which is totally understandable given the awful things that you went through. But I was also so delighted to hear that you really did get help with treatment and you're feeling so much better now. So was there any particular therapy that you tried that did work? Because I'm sure mums would be interested to know what kind of services are out there.
Yes, so I did EMDR, which is light therapy, and it basically what it does, it timestamps these horrific memories that you have. So it trying not to get too technical, but for me, what it did was it made the miscarriages seem much more remote. So if something that previously might have been quite triggering, which would bring these memories back, then what EMDR did was essentially give context to those disturbing memories, which meant that the triggering sensations and what I was feeling became less acute. So the miscarriages, to me, I remember saying to my therapist that they just felt more remote and further away, and it was hard work. It's something that's actually not really done during pregnancy. This was something we had to do after the pregnancy, and she wanted me to commit to a lot of sessions, which I ended up doing, but I was only able to do that because I had the support, someone able to look after my baby, to be able to resolve this. But of course, as they said earlier, the maternity trauma loss care service and that specifically is not available to all women across the country, and I think that's incredibly unfair because it was a lifeline to me, really, to be able to almost move forwards and put the losses behind me.
I totally agree with that point from both of you. And with my former politician hat on, I think it's fair to say that I've been campaigning very hard to end that postcode lottery of maternity care. So let's hope the government takes action in its new maternity plan later in the year. And you both mentioned in your answers about references to sort of partners and wider family. And I wondered if we could talk about them for a moment. So, Karen, I think they're slightly overlooked, I feel, because they're obviously not the mum. They're not the one technically going through the miscarriage, but obviously they're deeply affected too. So who is there to support them as well?
It's a real issue, this, I think, that for dads, because when we think about the maternity setting, as you say, it is for women. It's women's services that are delivering maternity services in the NHS. And so dads basically are sort of bystanders. They are witnesses so often to some really, really difficult things. It impacts them greatly. We at Petals, as I say, we aim to support both partners, so men can come on their own. And interestingly, we've seen an increase in that of men coming for counselling with Petals on their own over recent years. And I think that is because we're talking more openly about it. But I think that it's that traditional idea that the partner is there to support the mum, and so that often means for men that they just sort of push away their feelings. They get on with the practical stuff. They ensure that things within the home are looked after, and will do the organisation of funerals or things like that if that's needed. And so often they don't talk about their experience of this loss. It's almost like they don't feel able to talk about this, entitled to talk about this. And that's so what we see then is men storing up all sorts of trauma as a consequence of that, and being quite fearful about subsequent pregnancies. It sort of emerges, I think, we see in subsequent pregnancies if it hasn't been processed, or in trying to conceive for another baby. This often impacts men at that point and makes them quite scared of another pregnancy. And so it's so important that, men feel comfortable with accessing support. One of the ways that feels quite comfortable for men is often through this medium, through podcasts. And there are a few podcasts out there that are very much targeted at men, Dad's Still Standing is the one that I'm most aware of, and we have many of our parents talk about that. There's also the football Sands United, linked to the charity Sands, where men come together to play football. It feels like a really comfortable way, very often for men, to just be with their loss and think about their children that haven't who aren't with them. But yeah, I would say that this is an area we need to be focused on in opening up.
Well, I'm so pleased that you mentioned some of those podcasts. And for anyone listening today who doesn't have a pen, don't panic. We have all the links in the show notes for you today. And I so related to what you just said, Karen, because actually a lot of dads get in touch with me about the show to say that they feel ignored and they're feeling traumatized too. And for anyone who's interested in dad's experience, do check out our episode earlier in the year in series 1, where we have 2 dads who come on the show to talk about their experience of PTSD and recovery. So do look at that episode. And Molly, if we could just talk a bit about this issue of the wider family. You obviously mentioned about your husband coming to some of their appointments. And also, we haven't talked about the fact that you obviously had a son while many of these things were going on. And how do you talk to another sibling about what's happening when they're a young child? So what was the experience like for, your other child and your partner?
Well, I think for my husband, I contribute to a few support groups now on recurrent miscarriage, and what comes up time and time again is that relationships often break down. For us, it had the reverse effect. I think it made us very, very close, and it just felt at times that we were in our own little bubble dealing with our grief in this way, where we prefer just to be by ourselves and together with our son, just a little unit of 3, rather than having to go out and speak to anyone about what was going on. And I think my husband was so unbelievably supportive, and not just with whatever I was going through, but I think I felt so guilty, but it was never him who was making me feel guilty, and I just wanted to do everything I could from a practical point of view to try and resolve the issues. And I think that was particularly helpful for him, feeling that we were sort of making progress and moving forward. So this is a slightly different topic, but we spent quite a bit of our savings on recurrent miscarriage investigation, because it's actually what you can be tested for in this country is quite limited. And I think that was helpful to him to feel like we were always moving forwards. That was very important, that I was able to recognise, actually, with the help of Petals, that's something he needed to do. In terms of my son, I think anyone who's gone through recurrent miscarriage, particularly where surgery is needed, I was having to go to appointment after appointment. I had overnight hospital stays. The time involved was relentless, and that was particularly difficult. We didn't tell him about the losses because it was early enough that we didn't need to. But also, I found it very, very difficult, I think, when so much of my time was having to be spent going to these appointments after appointments to also work at the same time. I found being able to having to manage all of that and be there for my son difficult. So I did take a period of time out after my second and then my third miscarriage from work, where I needed to recover mentally and physically, but also because I just simply couldn't do it all. I couldn't manage to do the appointments and be there for him. And we were lucky enough that I was able to do that.
And can I ask, Molly, did you tell your employer what had happened? Because one of the things that mums are asking me about when I read our messages on social media is when they're in a really similar situation, they feel really ashamed to speak about it, even though what's happened to them is, not their fault. It's something that's happened to their body and it is no mistake of their own. So I've had that question from other mums. So is there any advice that you both give them in that scenario about who they should talk to, and what is your advice about going back to work in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky that I'm still there, a really wonderful employer when it comes to that sort of thing, because I've seen queries across my support groups where women aren't treated in the same way. And I was very honest. The partners I work for, I told them straight away if I'd miscarried, particularly because I needed to go and have surgery. And so I think actually honesty, if you're able to be honest, and lots of people going through this aren't able to be honest, but if you're able to be honest, I think that helps, because it helps someone understand why you might be absent from work. I actually found work helpful in a way, because it's the only place where I could go where I didn't have to talk about it. I think there's a certain expectation amongst friends and family. The question is, how are you? And I found that very, very difficult to answer, because I was terrible going through all of this. I was felt so guilty. I was so alone, grieving the loss of these babies that I'd miscarried. But work was somewhere where, particularly because we were working remotely, there was no expectation to say, "Oh, how are you?" And you just got on with your work. So from that point of view, I had the support, and they knew what was going on, but at the same time, I could get on and continue to work, which I found very helpful. I think almost the most challenging thing for me, though, was navigating relationships with family and friends. It became very difficult. Lost some friendships over it. I think there's an expectation that friends will be there and know what to say, and of course, not everyone does. Same goes for family, although still on very good terms with all my family, but there's still pain there. I think for both my husband and I, that certain people we expected to do better and be better at supporting us weren't, and that was incredibly painful. And then you find yourself withdrawing because you just don't want to engage in that sort of thing. And I think comments like a lot of friends would unknowingly complain about how tired they were with their newborn baby or their 2 children and everything. And ever since going through all this, I've just thought that the tiredness you associate with a newborn is a privilege, and it's nothing to complain about.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Molly. And I so related so much to what you're saying. And I've had this conversation with other friends, particularly about birthdays. As in some ways it's a celebration, but for a lot of mums, it's a day of real sadness, and it's a really triggering day to remember things that happened to them, and they're not always sure what to say. So, Karen, from a kind of counselling perspective, is that something that Petals can help mums with if they're struggling to articulate this to friends, family, to colleagues at work, and they do want to talk about it, but they don't know how?
Yeah, it comes up all the time. So many of our sessions are taken with talking exactly about that, about how to be with family and friends, how to be with work colleagues, how to manage this. And one of the things I always say to our clients and to our counsellors as well, that I think it's important to think about your loss in the same way you may be thinking you would think about your child if your child was here. So we often have a clear view about how involved we want anyone else in the upbringing of our child, or the sharing of the responsibility of the childcare and everything, and how we want to talk about that, how private we might want to keep that within work or within social media, all of those things. And to think about loss in a similar way. I say to women, this is your loss. This isn't anybody else's. This is yours, and you can determine how this is spoken about, how this is shared with others. And if you don't want to talk about it with others, that's fine. But if you do, then that is also your right and your prerogative. And maybe to think about how the people around you, to tell people how you want them to be with that, to explain what it means to you and actually what you need from them. And I think particularly with employers, that's not always an easy thing to do, but I think it can be a very helpful thing if you can talk about actually where you are and what you need from them. We spend a lot of time also talking to employers who come to us saying, give us some advice on how to work in this field and support our employees. And that is the response I would give. It's like, let them tell you what they want, and then listen to that and respect that and honour that.
Absolutely. And we're already coming towards the end of the episode. So just finally on our topic today, Molly, you've talked about navigating pregnancy after recurrent loss. And I think a lot of families listening to today's episode might have a similar experience to yourself where they've had multiple miscarriages and wondering whether they should keep continuing. And why I'm so pleased you came on the show is that you did have 4 losses, but then you did go on to have another baby. So is there anything you'd like to say to a mum listening in a similar situation?
If someone wants to have more children, to persevere, I think it's very difficult in this country because so little is actually known about recurrent miscarriage. It's not as if you can get a diagnosis and then you go off and have treatment. There are some conditions that are easily recognised, like some of the clotting disorders are recognised, but most women probably won't find out why they have miscarried, and that is very, very difficult. So it requires quite a lot of resilience to make the decision to continue. But I found a recurrent miscarriage consultant. I actually went to see 3, and it was the third one I went to see who ended up putting me on a protocol that was successful. But the first recurrent miscarriage consultant, who I might add is leading in his field, told me to turn to surrogacy, and he said he'd be very surprised if I ever carried any more children. And obviously I went on to have my 2 daughters. So I think if you have the resilience and the support from your other half to be able to continue to do it, it might take time, it might take a very long time, but to try and get answers and to persevere in order to try and get answers is something that I would encourage every woman to do if they do want to expand their family. But I'll caveat that on the support groups I contribute to, you get posts from time to time where someone is saying, I've decided to stop trying and I've had enough miscarriages now. And that is also very hard. I think it's such a personal decision. It really is. And it's a very difficult decision because of the fact that treatment is such a big question mark.
And the point is there's no right or wrong answer. As you're saying, it's a personal decision for the mum. Well, I think that's a good time to ask you both one of the questions that I ask every guest on Breaking the Taboo, which is to give some really practical advice to signpost affected families to. So, Karen, what would you like to signpost mums to as a resource?
Well, I have to say, Petals, I strongly encourage any parent who is going through miscarriage and feels they need some psychological support to go to Petals' website to find the referral form on there. It is there. You can self-refer and to complete the details. And if we can see you, we will. We are limited by funding for the charitable pathway self-referrals, but we will always try. And it's only through knowing that the need is there that we can actually get that funding to expand that. So certainly comes Petals. There's also resources within that. We also have Facebook groups, we have support groups, all there to basically carry you through this experience.
And I think don't underestimate the importance of peer-to-peer sharing. And for anyone
Absolutely.
listening to today's episode, do join a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group or meet another family who's had a similar experience, because I know both myself and Molly have found it's made a huge difference talking to others. And Molly, what would you like to signpost listeners to?
Well, Petals was so important for me, and that answer's already been given. So I'm going to say, if your area has a maternity trauma and loss care service, it was amazing, and my therapist was absolutely incredible and allowed me to navigate an incredibly difficult pregnancy, and then was able to help me resolve my PTSD afterwards. And I think pregnancy after loss is so hard, and it's so terrifying. It really is terrifying. It takes up every ounce of your energy. Every waking thought is my baby alive or dead, and you never know until that point of your scan. And I think to live like that for 8 months is incredibly difficult. So being able to have the tools to try and navigate a pregnancy after loss is something I would urge every mother to go and contact the maternity trauma and loss care service as soon as they possibly can, really, if they're pregnant.
And if anyone listening to today's show who's thinking about asking for help, then do. And also do signpost this as a resource to other friends or family that you know are affected, so that we can help as many people as possible to get access to resources that they need. And my last question is a bit more political. And you both know that I was a Member of Parliament and I chaired the UK's birth trauma inquiry. And we heard some really shocking evidence about this postcode lottery that you both mentioned in maternity care. So, Karen, we do know that politicians are listening to the podcast. In fact, we've had some of them on the show. So if the Prime Minister was listening today, what would you like to tell him to do to improve care for new mums, and particularly anyone who's suffered from baby loss or miscarriage?
Oh my goodness, that would be a wonderful opportunity. Please, the first thing I would say was, please, can I meet you? That would be my first point, because I would love to be able to sit down with Prime Minister or with Wes Streeting just to talk about the work that we're doing and the gap that we're filling here. And I think for me, it is about that gap that we need politicians to do something about this. We have part of the jigsaw puzzle in place now. We have the certificates for parents to apply for miscarriage. We also now have a bill being discussed anyway about bereavement leave for parents following miscarriage. And we have the maternal mental health services that Molly's talked so wonderfully about in place. But there is this gap in between for all of those families who are psychologically distressed from baby loss, who don't have any support, who aren't poorly enough to access the maternal mental health services, and they're falling through the cracks. And we have the answers at Petals. We genuinely do have the answers. We also have the evidence to back up those answers. So please, let me have the opportunity to share all of that with you.
Absolutely. It's hard to always whittle it down to one ask. And Molly, you're an affected mum. What would you like the government to do to take action on this issue?
So a particular grievance of mine, and something that makes me very angry, is if you're pregnant and you attend your antenatal appointments, you have a legal right to go and attend them, and you get paid. You can continue getting paid by your employer and everything. If you've gone through recurrent loss, if you want to go and have recurrent miscarriage treatment, you don't have any particular right to go to these appointments. And sometimes treatment can be incredibly time consuming and everything. And I'm not talking about your GP giving you a sick note immediately after miscarriage, which you're entitled to have to help you recover. I'm talking about treatment that might be needed over a few months or whatever. So I would like to see some sort of change which would protect women, to enable them to go to these appointments or to have this treatment, and for their jobs to be protected at the same time, rather like in a situation if you were pregnant and you were attending your hospital appointments throughout your pregnancy. That's what I'd like to see.
Well, those are all very good requests. And I think it's rest assured to you both that myself and Rosie Duffield MP, who chairs the all-party parliamentary group on birth trauma, keep making the same points to the Health Secretary and the government. And let's hope that the December maternity task force will report back with some strong recommendations for Wes Streeting to implement. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of the episode. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to both of my guests for coming on today. Miscarriage is a really difficult subject, and for anyone who was interested to hear about Molly's story, she's actually written it down very bravely in my book, Breaking the Taboo: Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma. And in there's also a bit more information about the birth trauma inquiry that I mentioned and some of the policy recommendations that we had for the British government. And if you enjoyed today's episode, then please do rate us on iTunes or Spotify. Please do share this episode with friends, family and colleagues. we do want to make sure that we're reaching as many affected families as possible. So stay tuned next week for the next episode of Breaking the Taboo. Bye-bye for now.